There is a phrase that, if you live anywhere below the largest dam on Earth, should stop your heart. The Three Gorges Dam has opened every gate. Because what that phrase actually means is that the greatest reservoir ever assembled behind a single wall can hold no more. That the inland sea stacked up behind that concrete has risen to the edge of what the structure can safely take. And that the only thing left to do, the only option remaining, is to let the flood through. To throw open the spillways and release a torrent of water down the Yangtze, deliberately, onto the tens of millions of people living on the plains below. And when that happens, the dam that was built to stop flooding becomes, in that moment, the largest single source of flooding in the world. This is not a hypothetical about the dam collapsing. This is something far more real, because it has already happened, and it will happen again. In the worst flood seasons, when torrential rains hammer the Yangtze Basin and the water pouring into the reservoir reaches staggering, record-breaking rates, the operators of the Three Gorges Dam face a choice with no good answer. And they open the gates. The water roars out below the dam in a controlled release that is nonetheless a wall of water. And downstream, the cities and farms and villages of the middle and lower Yangtze flood, sometimes catastrophically, tens of millions of lives disrupted, hundreds of lives lost, tens of billions in damage, in floods that arrive partly from the sky and partly from the dam itself. So this is the story of the impossible choice at the heart of the world's biggest dam, the moment when it opens every gate, and the catastrophe that unfolds downstream when it does. It is a story about the limits of even the mightiest engineering, about a promise of flood control that runs into the hard ceiling of physics, and about what it means to live on the plains below a wall that, when the water rises high enough, must sacrifice you to save itself. Because the terrible truth is that opening every gate is not a failure of the dam. It is the dam working exactly as designed, and that is precisely what makes it so frightening. Let me take you downstream, to the moment the released water arrives, because that is where the abstraction becomes real. Picture a city on the middle Yangtze, below the dam, during a bad flood summer. It has already been raining for weeks, the kind of relentless, drenching monsoon rain that swells every stream and saturates every field, and the river is already high, lapping at the tops of the great dikes that have protected the city for generations. The people are already exhausted, already sandbagging, already watching the brown water rise. And then word comes down the river that upstream, the Three Gorges Dam, its own reservoir filled to the brink by the same rains, is increasing its releases, opening more gates, sending more water down. The people on the dikes understand exactly what that means. The river, already at its limit, is about to receive a fresh surge from above. Over the following hours, the water climbs higher, past marks that have stood for decades, and the defense becomes a desperate, round-the-clock battle. Soldiers and residents piling sandbags in the rain, reinforcing the dikes, watching the river try to climb over the top. In the worst cases, the water wins. A dike is overtopped or gives way, and the flood pours into the streets, into the homes, across the farmland, and a district or a whole city goes under. That is the moment. Not a dam bursting, but a dam doing its job, releasing water it can no longer hold, and the people below paying the price for the survival of the wall upstream. And what makes it so cruel is that there is no enemy to fight, no failure to blame, nothing that went wrong. The rain fell, the reservoir filled, the gates opened exactly as the manual said they should, and the water came anyway. The family on the roof, watching the brown flood swallow the streets they grew up on, is not the victim of a disaster in the ordinary sense. They are the victim of a system working correctly, of a decision that was, by every measure but their own, the right one to make. To understand why they opened the gates, you have to understand the brutal arithmetic of a reservoir during a great flood, because it leaves the operators no real choice. The Three Gorges Reservoir is enormous, but it is not infinite, and during an extreme flood, it can fill with terrifying speed. In the worst flood seasons, the rate of water flowing into the reservoir has reached staggering levels, tens of thousands of cubic meters every single second, a volume that would fill an ordinary lake in hours. The reservoir has a large amount of space set aside specifically to catch and hold floodwater, and in a normal flood, that is exactly what it does, swallowing the surge and releasing it slowly, protecting the cities below. But when the flood is big enough, that space fills up, and once it is full, the physics become inescapable. Whatever flows into a full reservoir must flow out, because there is nowhere else for it to go, and if the operators refuse to release it, the water simply keeps rising until it threatens the dam itself, until it climbs toward the top of the structure, at which point they risk not a managed flood downstream, but the catastrophic failure of the entire dam. So they open the gates. They release the water, matching the outflow to the inflow, because the alternative is to let the reservoir overtop and endanger the wall holding back the largest artificial sea on the planet. The choice, once the reservoir is full, is not between flooding downstream and not flooding downstream. It is between a controlled flood downstream and a catastrophic one. Between releasing the water on purpose and having the dam release it all at once by failing. Faced with that, they open every gate and the flood goes to the cities, because the only thing worse than the flood is what happens if the dam does not survive. And when they do open every gate, the sight and the sound of it is something out of a nightmare. A spectacle of raw power that puts the whole crisis into a single image. On an ordinary day, the water leaves the dam quietly, funneled through the turbines to make electricity. But when the reservoir is full and the flood must be passed, the operators open the spillway gates, and the water comes through in great roaring jets. Thick white columns of it blasting out under the enormous pressure of the reservoir behind, hitting the river below with a force that throws up a permanent cloud of mist and a roar you can feel in your chest from far away. When every gate is open, the entire face of the dam becomes a wall of exploding water, an almost unimaginable volume pouring through every second. More than would flow over many of the world's great waterfalls, released not by nature but by human hands making a desperate calculation. It is genuinely awesome to witness, in the old sense of the word, a display of power that reminds you of the sheer quantity of water being managed here. But every one of those thundering jets is water on its way downstream. Water headed for the dikes and the cities and the fields below, and the more magnificent the release looks at the dam, the worse the flood will be for the people who live beneath it. The spectacle of the open gates is beautiful and terrible at once. The visible moment when the reservoir gives up and passes its burden to the plains. And that reveals the impossible dilemma sitting at the very center of the world's largest dam, a dilemma with no way out. The Three Gorges Dam has two jobs during a flood that are fundamentally in tension with each other. It is supposed to protect the people downstream by holding back floodwater, and it must protect itself, the structure, from being overwhelmed, because its own failure would be an apocalypse far greater than any flood it could release. In a moderate flood, these two goals align. The dam holds the water back, everyone is protected, and the design works beautifully. But in an extreme flood, they come apart, and the dam cannot do both. To fully protect the people downstream, it would have to hold back all the water, which in a mega flood would mean letting its reservoir rise past the safe limit and risking the dam. To protect itself, it must release the water, which floods the people downstream. There is no setting, no clever operation, no heroic effort that resolves this once the flood exceeds the reservoir's capacity. Someone gets flooded. And when the choice is between the cities below and the dam itself, the dam wins every time because it has to. Because a failed Three Gorges Dam would kill vastly more people than any controlled release. So the operators do the only thing they can. They sacrifice the downstream in a managed and limited way to preserve the structure and prevent the far greater catastrophe. It is a rational, defensible, even necessary choice, and it means that the people on the plains below are in the ultimate emergency. Expendable in service of the wall above them, which is a terrible thing to be, and most of them have no idea that they are. So, what does the flood downstream actually look like when the gates are open and the water comes? The answer is a catastrophe measured in the tens of millions. When the great floods come to the Yangtze and the dam releases into an already swollen river. The scale of the disaster downstream is almost hard to comprehend. In the worst recent flood seasons, tens of millions of people across the Yangtze Basin have been affected, their homes flooded, their livelihoods destroyed, their cities and villages inundated. Hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions, have been forced to evacuate. Vast areas of farmland have gone underwater, drowning crops across one of the most important agricultural regions of the country. Cities have seen their streets turned to rivers, their ground floors submerged, their economies paralyzed. The financial losses run into the tens of billions. Lives are lost, sometimes in the hundreds, to drowning, to collapsing buildings, to landslides triggered by the saturated ground. This is not a minor side effect. It is a major, recurring natural and human disaster, one of the largest flood catastrophes on the planet in the years it strikes, and the released water from the dam is woven right through it, part of the surge that overwhelms the defenses. The dam does reduce the total flooding compared to what the raw, untamed river would have delivered, and its defenders are right to point that out. But reduce is not prevent, and in the biggest years, what gets through, including what the dam itself must release, is still a catastrophe of staggering proportions. To understand why the stakes feel so high, you have to know the history of the river the dam was meant to tame, because the Yangtze is one of the deadliest rivers in the history of the world. For thousands of years, its floods have periodically drowned the same crowded plains, and the great floods of the last century were catastrophes almost beyond belief. In the early 1930s, a series of floods along the Yangtze and China's other great rivers killed an almost unfathomable number of people, by some estimates hundreds of thousands to millions, through drowning, famine, and disease, ranking among the deadliest natural disasters ever recorded. Decades later, another enormous Yangtze flood killed tens of thousands and left millions homeless. And near the end of the century, a great flood devastated the basin again, killing thousands and causing staggering damage. A disaster fresh in memory when the Three Gorges Dam was being built. That history is the reason the dam exists, and the reason its flood control promise was so precious. The people of the Yangtze Plains have generational memory of the river as a killer, and the dam was offered as the answer, the mighty wall that would finally end the cycle of watery death. So when the gates open and the flood comes anyway, it lands not on a people unfamiliar with the river's violence, but on one that was promised, at last, to be safe from it, which makes the return of the flood, even a lessened one, all the more bitter. The dam was built to close a chapter that the river keeps insisting on reopening. And here is the myth that this shatters: the belief that a big enough dam can simply end flooding forever, because it cannot, and the reason is fundamental. When the Three Gorges Dam was built, one of its great promises was flood control, the idea that this mighty structure would finally tame the deadly Yangtze and protect the plains from the floods that had killed so many for so long. And within limits, it does that. But there is a hard ceiling on what any dam can do, set by the finite size of its reservoir. A dam can catch and hold a flood only up to the volume of empty space it has available. When a flood is larger than that space, the dam runs out of room, and beyond that point it can no longer hold the water back. It can only pass it through, becoming, in effect, a very expensive part of the river rather than a barrier to it. So a dam does not eliminate floods. It raises the threshold, absorbing the small and medium floods that would once have caused damage, while remaining helpless against the truly extreme ones that exceed its capacity. And there is a cruel psychological trap in this. Because the dam handles the ordinary floods so well, people downstream come to believe they are safe, and they build and settle and grow complacent on the floodplain. Right up until the mega flood arrives that the dam cannot hold, at which point there are more people and more property in harm's way than ever before. The promise of flood control, taken too far, does not just fail to prevent the great disasters, it can make them worse by luring more lives into the path of the flood that will eventually come. And the trust that gets broken in these moments runs deep, because the people downstream were told the dam would save them. For the residents of the middle and lower Yangtze, the Three Gorges Dam was sold as protection, a guarantee that the terrible floods of the past would not return. So when the gates open and the water rises and their homes go under, there is not just fear and loss, but a sense of betrayal, a dawning understanding that the dam's first priority, when the crisis is at its worst, is not them. There is real and understandable anger in the flooded regions, a feeling that they are being sacrificed, that the water is being sent onto their fields and their towns to protect the dam and the interests upstream. Sometimes that anger is directed at decisions about which areas to flood, because in a severe flood, authorities may deliberately divert water into designated flood zones, rural areas and farmland, to relieve pressure on the dikes protecting the major cities, which means someone's village is intentionally sacrificed to save someone else's city. Whether or not each specific fear is justified, the underlying reality is real, and it is bitter. Below the dam, in the worst moments, some people will be flooded to protect others and to protect the structure itself. And the grand promise of total protection dissolves into the hard, unequal calculus of who gets saved and who gets given to the water. That is a hard thing to learn while you are stacking sandbags in the rain, watching the river rise, because the dam upstream has opened its gates. And there is a grim, deliberate side to flood management on the Yangtze that most people never hear about. One that makes the calculus of who gets flooded chillingly literal. Along the river, there are designated flood diversion zones, rural areas and farmland set aside in advance to be deliberately flooded when the crisis is severe enough. The logic is coldly rational. When the river is about to overwhelm the dikes protecting a major city, authorities can choose to breach a levee somewhere else on purpose, opening a controlled path for the water to spill into a designated zone of farms and villages, sacrificing that ground to lower the river and save the city. It is, in the pure arithmetic of disaster, the right call, trading a smaller area of countryside for a larger, more valuable, more densely populated city. But imagine being on the wrong side of that arithmetic. Imagine being told that your village, your fields, your home has been chosen as the place the flood will be sent so that people somewhere else can stay dry. Families in these zones can be given little time to gather what they can and flee before the water is deliberately turned onto their land. Their entire world submerged by a decision made in a control room to protect someone else. This is the hidden human face of managing a flood this large, that saving the many sometimes means deliberately drowning the few, and that below the great dam and along its river, there are people who live with the knowledge that when the worst comes, their home is the one already marked to be given to the water. And the released water does more than simply flood the towns, because on its way down, it attacks the river system itself. The huge, high-energy releases from the dam scour the riverbed and the banks downstream, eroding the channel and undermining the very dikes that are supposed to hold the water back, so that the flood defenses are being chewed at by the same releases they are meant to contain. The Great Lakes that connect to the Middle Yangtze, the natural overflow basins that once helped absorb the river's floods, are affected too, their relationship with the river altered by the dam and the sediment, so they cannot always cushion the surge the way they once did. And the flood paralyzes one of the most important arteries in the country, because the Yangtze is a vital shipping highway, carrying an enormous flow of goods deep into the interior, and a major flood shuts that traffic down, severing a key channel of the economy for weeks. Add the mass displacement, the millions forced from their homes into temporary shelters, the drowned farmland threatening the food supply, the factories and businesses idled across a core industrial region, and the true cost of an open gate flood spreads far beyond the water itself, rippling through the transportation, the agriculture, the industry, and the daily lives of a huge share of the nation. The flood does not just wet the plains. It reaches into the machinery of the country and jams it, and then recedes, leaving behind a cleanup and a rebuilding measured in the tens of billions. Until the next time. And this is only going to happen more often, because the pressures driving these extreme floods are all intensifying at once. The climate is warming, and a warmer atmosphere holds more moisture and delivers heavier, more extreme rainfall, which means the monstrous flood seasons that fill the reservoir and force the gates open are expected to become more frequent and more severe. At the same time, the reservoir's ability to absorb floods is slowly shrinking because the Yangtze carries an immense load of sediment, and that silt steadily accumulates behind the dam, filling in space that was meant to hold floodwater. Over the decades, as the sediment builds up, the reservoir has less room to catch a surge, which means it fills faster, and the operators must open the gates sooner in a given flood than they once would have. So you have a vise closing from both sides, bigger floods coming in, and less space to hold them, pushing toward more frequent, earlier, larger releases onto the people below. Add to that the fact that there are other dams and reservoirs across the vast Yangtze system, all making their own release decisions, all sometimes forced to let water go at the same time, and you have a whole network of managed rivers that can, in the worst conditions, be releasing together, compounding the surge that reaches the crowded lower plains. The impossible choice at the Three Gorges Dam is not a rare event that happened once. It is a recurring crisis that the changing climate and the aging reservoir are making more common, a gate opening that the future will demand again and again. Stand below the Three Gorges Dam on a calm day, and it is a marvel. The water flowing smoothly through, the turbines humming, the mighty river seemingly mastered, and it is easy to believe that human engineering has finally conquered the Yangtze once and for all. But wait for the great flood, the one that comes every few years now and will come more often, and watch what happens. The rains fall for weeks, the reservoir fills to its limit, and the operators face the choice that has no good answer, and they open the gates, every one of them, and the largest reservoir on Earth pours its excess down onto the plains where tens of millions of people live. The dam does not fail. It does exactly what it was built to do, which is to survive, and to pass the flood it cannot hold on to the people below. And downstream, the water rises over the dikes and into the streets and across the fields, and the catastrophe unfolds again, partly from the sky and partly from the concrete. A disaster that the greatest dam ever built can lessen but never truly stop. The people on the plains will rebuild and forget and trust the wall again until the next great flood, when the gates open once more and the river reminds them of the thing the dam can never change, that all the concrete in the world cannot make an infinite reservoir, and when the water rises high enough, someone downstream has to receive it. Below the biggest dam on earth, that someone is always them. And that is the quiet, permanent condition of life on those plains, a condition the concrete changed, but could never cancel. The dam moved the danger, softened it, delayed it, took the edge off the ordinary years, and in exchange it concentrated the ultimate risk into a single wall and a single decision made upstream. In the worst hours of the worst floods, by people the villagers will never meet. When the sky opens and the reservoir fills and the gates swing wide, the largest machine ever built to control water becomes, for a few days, simply the largest source of it, and everything below learns again the oldest lesson of the river: that water always goes downhill, that it always finds the people in the low places, and that no wall, however vast, has ever repealed that law. It is only decided on their behalf when the reckoning comes due.